Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Fernanda Martinez. I am Networks Manager at the Wellbeing Project based in Mexico. And together with me, hosting this session is from University of Illinois in Chicago, Dr. Denise Wood, a researcher and evaluator with a focus on mental health and well-being and resilience in school and community settings. Her interest in this work was born out of her direct practice as a teacher and therapist, supporting a wide range of children and youth. She completed her master's in clinical and social work at the University of Chicago and her PhD in education at University of British Columbia. Also with us is Mariam Al-Khalaf, a research associate at the World Innovation Summit for Education, or better known as WISE, an initiative of Qatar Foundation. Mariam's main research focus areas include educational leadership, higher education, entrepreneurship education, well-being and learning sciences, and social and emotional learning. Mariam completed her bachelor's degree from King's College London and holds a master's degree from the École des Hautes Études Commerciales à Paris. Now, let me pose a question to you all, and feel free to open your microphones or write on the chat box what you think. Do you believe that teacher well-being influences student well-being? Thank you for your answer, Rada. Happy to see you here. Thank you, me. I completely agree with you. I'm also a former teacher. This question, do you believe that teacher well-being influences students' well-being? It's a question worth pondering, especially in the face of the escalating crisis surrounding children's mental health and educational disparities. The global impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and other disruptive events have underscored the urgent need of collective action. Today, we present the findings from our research into the relationship between teacher and student well-being in the context of learning and teaching. In the midst of these challenges, our aim is clear: to provide insights that not only advance knowledge, but also inform the creation of learning environments where both teacher and students can thrive. Again, thank you for joining us on this journey to reimagine education for a future where well-being takes center stage. I will put on the chat box the link to our research and leave the floor to Denise, who will talk more about one of the two components of our report, the scoping review.
Hey, thank you so much. I just want to make sure. Can everyone see that first slide? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So this research took place at the last year and was finished at the end of November. And so this report brings together two parts of a project. And the project is called Leveraging the Evidence on the Relation of Teacher Wellbeing to Student Wellbeing and Learning, a Scoping Review, and Educator and Student Interviews. Sorry, being a little slow at this moment. There we go. Oops. So this project was generously funded by the WISE Foundation, and we were very grateful to receive this funding to do the work. The project team consisted of several researchers from the University of Illinois at Chicago. The principal investigator was Dr. Kimberly Schonert-Reichel, who has worked in this area for several decades, focusing on teacher well-being and social and emotional learning. In addition, we had several researchers from the University of Illinois and Miriam and Ahmed from WISE. So it was quite a large undertaking for both of these parts of the project. So I'm just having a few little issues with getting the slides to advance. There's a little bit of a lag. I might have to stop sharing and start again. Let's try that again. Okay, so hopefully that, there we go. Okay, so the current study, there's two parts to the current study. The first is a scoping review, which I'll talk about, and the second part are interviews with educators and students, which Miriam will talk about. Okay. And I apologize, there's quite a bit of a lag to get the slides to shift for some reason. Okay, there we go. The aims of the scoping review were to analyze and consolidate research on the relationship between teacher and student well-being and learning in K-12 education, including what methods are used in the research to conceptualize and measure teacher well-being and student well-being and learning. So to do this, we felt it was important to understand where the field is at this point in time. The second aim was to evaluate and integrate the results of this scoping review to understand what the gaps are and to what degree the field is covered to date. So to do this, the research included peer-reviewed and academic gray literature in the K-12 field that was published between January 2000 to April 2003. And we only focused on using empirical studies about, they had to mention both teacher and student well-being and learning, because there's a lot of research that focuses only on teacher well-being or student well-being or student well-being and learning, but they had to contain both components so that we could see whether the research is pointing to links between these two groups of educational participants. The studies had to be in English, and the studies had to be conducted during regular school hours. So the English was more because we didn't have the capacity to include studies with other languages due to language barriers. So English was the language that we went with. Sorry, it's just slow again, the lag. I'm not sure why it's being so slow. Hmm. Hmm. There we go. Very slow. Okay. So in this research, in terms of the scoping review, there were, you can see almost 9,000 articles retrieved. And then from that process, several were removed, and then went through, and then 7,600 went through an initial screening. So that meant that the team actually went through each of those articles to see if they did include both dimensions of teacher well-being and student well-being and learning. And this was done by reading the abstracts and the titles. From there, 240 articles were taken for full screening, meaning the article was read in its entirety. And that resulted in a total of 67 articles that were included in the final analysis. But a lot of spinning here. I apologize. It's my it appears to be frozen. So I think what I might do is, because it keeps freezing and it's very slow, I'm going to verbally tell you what the results were of the screening. So essentially, in the end, what we found was that most of the studies look at teacher well-being, and fewer look at the link between teacher well-being and student well-being and learning. And so there's a lot more research that needs to be conducted in this area to understand what is really going on. There's also not enough research at this time to understand causality. In other words, does teacher well-being cause the level of student well-being, or is it the case that there's a reciprocal relationship, that teacher well-being and student well-being work together? So there's a bit of an energy that goes back and forth between these two groups. We also don't have a lot of longitudinal data. We have cross-sectional data. So we have a point in time to understand these these constructs, but we don't have enough information to understand what happens over time. Is teacher well-being and student well-being, do they change together over time, or is it more static? And so we need more research that really looks at that with, using such designs as randomized control trials, quasi-experimental designs. So designs that allow us more to understand the direction of how teacher well-being impacts student well-being and learning. The other thing that was really interesting about the research was that we found that in articles, there's no definition of what teacher well-being is. Everyone has a very, very different definition. And so there's not a consensus among researchers. What do we mean when we're talking about teacher well-being? What do we mean when we're talking about student well-being? And so that is a challenge in the field, because when we say that, we kind of, I think, perhaps assume that we're talking about the same thing, but the wide range of how people see what that is was quite striking. So there's definitely more work needed to understand if we're actually talking about the same thing when we do bring up this topic. And finally, looking forward, if we do this research in this field, we need to kind of have more sort of an understanding of the degree to which teacher well-being impacts student well-being and learning. And so we know that well-being impacts learning, but how do these three things work together? Teacher well-being, student well-being, and learning. Now, there are some limitations with the scoping review. I think I mentioned the fact that we could only use articles that were in English. So we would love to be able to, in the future, include articles written in other languages and published in other countries to see if there are differences around the world, because that will be very interesting to see how different educators in different countries conceptualize well-being. And so that will be really important. The other issue is, how do we measure well-being? So what was found in the scoping review is that teacher well-being, and this gets into how everyone has different ideas of what do we mean by teacher well-being, but teacher well-being in most of the studies was seen as the absence of burnout, the absence of stress. So it was very kind of deficit focused rather than a positive focused way to look at well-being. So, and most of the studies reflected that. So they really considered well-being if you weren't burnt out, or if you weren't too dissatisfied with your job. So that's an interesting thing to consider too. Is well-being the absence of stress, or is well-being better looked at as having some assets and positives? And so those were the things that really stood out. We did see the last 5 years, really there's an increasing interest in this area. And it's growing a great deal. And that's in large part because people are seeing the amount of the workforce that is leaving the profession. And so there's a critical need to look at, well, how are we going to have enough teachers, and this is a worldwide problem, to support children to develop and grow when so many of them themselves are struggling and then opting to leave the profession. So there's much to be done, and it's a critical time given the challenges that are being faced worldwide. And we're just looking forward to seeing more research and more rigorous research in this area to really understand what is making a difference for both teachers and students. So I will leave it there and pass it to Miriam. I apologize for the freezing slides. But hopefully Miriam's slides are work out a little better than mine did.
Thank you, Denise. So Fernanda, can we check if the slides work? Or
Sure. Can you see them? Yeah, I think it worked well.
okay, thank you so much. So thank you, Denise, and I'll take it from here to explain more about the interview results. So we had interviews with both educators and students. But before starting, I would like to say that we defined well-being in this specific project as something that encompasses the quality of life and the ability of people and societies to contribute to the world with a sense of meaning and purpose. And this definition was taken from the World Health Organization. And as Denise said, that it's very hard to define well-being across multiple settings. So at least in this specific project, we defined well-being as a specific thing. So the results of the interviews, I would like to start with explaining the main themes or the thematic presentation that emerged from the data collection of both educators and students. As the themes were interrelated and after much examination of the data, 5 overreaching themes formed the structure for understanding the data. Each theme considered both the negative and the positive contributors. For example, the first theme, which is about the impact of educator well-being on student well-being, we looked at the positive side and we looked at the negative side. And for the second theme, we looked at the impact of the educator well-being on student learning. And for the third theme, we looked at the reciprocal relationship between the energy between both educators and students. And for the fourth theme, we looked at the impact of educator well-being on students' feeling about the educator. And finally, the impact of student well-being on educator well-being, which is the reciprocal relationship as well. So if we could move to the second slide, please. So moving on to the key findings, I would like to start with the positive results from higher levels of teacher well-being. The first finding, which is a general one, it's that there's a positive energy between educators and students, which fostered trust, safety, and a supportive environment and academic engagement. The second main finding is that high levels of educator well-being contributed to innovative teaching techniques, advanced cognitive skills development, and it increased interaction and adaptability to varying learning needs. The third main finding is that when educators show enjoyment in teaching and enjoy their roles as teachers, students will report more positive feelings, respect, and a warm connection to them. And finally, there is a positive energy as a result of a high well-being, which was characterized by enthusiasm and passion, and it fostered creativity, innovation, and a love for learning. So if we could go to the second slide, please. So for example, there is a quote here by a teacher which was interviewed in this project, and she said that if the teacher has very good well-being and she's able to form a supportive and caring relationship with his or her students, then the student will automatically be happy and satisfied. They feel like, oh, this teacher is always there. She's always going to take care of me with empathy and patience. So from this quote, we can understand that the teacher was seen to have a tremendous power to set a certain tone in the classroom, forming the foundation for the well-being and learning. And if we move to the second quote that we have, which was by a 16-year-old student, which was also interviewed in this project. And she said that it honestly makes me feel really motivated. I especially experienced this in a class where it's related to my dream career. And it's honestly like motivating me and making me happy to go in that classroom because she's like so happy about it, so excited about it. She's so excited to talk about this that it also makes me excited, which influences me in a way. So we can understand from these two quotes that if the teacher has higher level of well-being and that if the teacher shows positive energy in the classroom, it will automatically affect the students' well-being and their motivation to learn. And if we could move to the second slide. Thank you. So if we continue with the key findings, I'm going to focus here on the negative on the negative results from the lower levels of well-being. So the first one is that there is a negative relationships between educators and students. If there is a negative relationship between them, it will lead to less teacher-student interaction, more negative emotion and disruptive behavior. And the second finding is that educators who experience lower levels of well-being tend to adopt a task-oriented approach, prioritizing content delivery over active student engagement, leading to disengagement and passive teaching methods in the classroom. And finally, lower educator well-being resulted in a negative energy, which affects the learning process and students' feeling about their educational experience. So when educators did not appear to enjoy enjoy teaching, the students reported negative emotion and disengagement. So when we look at this quote by a teacher, and the teacher said that if I'm in a low spot, I'm just trying to get through the day, I think the quality of the learning goes down. If you look at it, we use a kind of 4 level scale to grade. If my well-being is not is not in a good place, I'm providing students with level 2 instead of level 4 kind of work. So it's, just do this to get it done. So I have evidence of something was done, move on to the next thing. And moving on to the second quote that I have, which was by a 17-year-old student who said that, well, probably, definitely, students that aren't engaged, probably playing games on their laptops and that sort of disconnectedness in a classroom where a message isn't getting across to the students, and lots of confusion and lots of unsettlement in the classroom, because if a teacher does not want to be there, then the students wouldn't want to be there either. So what we can understand from these two quotes as well, that if the teacher is having lower levels of well-being, and it will show in the classroom that the teacher has negative energy, it will affect the classroom, it will affect the students' well-being and their motivation to learn as well. So we see that there is like a reciprocal relationship between students' well-being and teachers' well-being, and also its effect on the students' learning outcomes. And I would like to end with that. There is a limitation for the interviews as well, and the interviews results. The first limitation is that the interviews were conducted in English only, as Denise mentioned earlier. And I think that's a limitation because we couldn't get like more information from different language or different countries setting. And the second limitation is that we had relatively small number of interviews, so that also affected the results of this project as well. And so that's it from my side. And I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions about the interview results. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariam. I can see in the chat box there was a little interaction between Christine and Denise. It says that Denise mentioned well-being is not defined well enough. I don't know if I miss it because I came in a little late. So my question is, how do you define well-being? I don't know, Denise, if you would like to elaborate more on this, because I think this is a nice question.
So, and that is a great question. So the scoping review really emphasized the need for a closer look at the definitions of well-being, because they were all varying definitions and there was no consensus. The first question of the teacher interviews, we asked them how they define well-being, and that's where we saw that they also have varying ways to define well-being. Some of them focus more on professional, their role in the school, and they kind of look at well-being as part of that professional role. And some of them looked at more broadly. They'd bring in things like sleep, nutrition, their social support network. So there was no agreement among individuals about what they consider to be well-being. And we talked a lot about this in the team, and and although we need to kind of understand it more, it may not be the case where there's one definition worldwide. That's probably not feasible, because there's different beliefs around well-being and different cultural components. But it is a discussion that would be wonderful to have around the world of the different components that people feel are part of well-being. And I know there has been some research in that area in terms of measurement, but it only included about 4 countries, and they took a survey tool and they adapted it for 4 countries. And even within the tool, they did include different questions depending on the country, because they consulted individuals in the country. So it would be an interesting, a very interesting avenue to pursue, to look at how we believe or what we believe the components of a well-being are, and whether some people see it as very holistic, or as others sort of think about professional well-being versus personal well-being. So thanks for that question.
Thanks so much for sharing the research. It's so great to see. My name is Radha Ruparel. I head a global leadership accelerator at Teach for All. So we're a global network of organizations working in 61 countries. And very similar, for the last 5 years, we've been doing work in teacher well-being. This year, we're launching a teacher well-being accelerator that's bringing together people from different countries like Colombia, Nigeria, Lebanon, and we're actually going to be in action to see what's shifting things. So just also happy to connect as you're doing your next phase of research. If you want to bring in voices from different places and different languages, very happy to connect on that. Two questions, because what we're like, we've seen the same thing. Intuitively, we've seen that student and teacher well-being are connected. We've seen it in classrooms. In New Zealand, for example, that reciprocal relationship, they even have a word for it, akal. So there's actually like language around some of these things that we're seeing. So I think this research helps validate. And so we're excited about, all right, so what? And so I'm curious in your research, two things. One is, as you were doing it, did you find anything around, what types of interventions are the ones that, are there certain ones that enable this more than others? Like we've seen social support networks or mindfulness interventions, or just even creating coaching or having space. Yeah, so anything you learned about that. And the second question I have is, as we're doing this action research, we want to encourage our partners around the world to be measuring. And so I'm also curious from the research, are there some, I know there's a variety of measurement methods, but are there some that you encourage us to take a look at that are stronger than others, that are more used in the field? Because we'd love to start, also bringing what we're learning back to fields like this. So yeah, interventions and anything you've learned around great measurement tools around well-being.
It's an interesting question. I think historically, there's been a lot of interventions around social emotional learning, which historically have been really focused on the students. Like we're going to bring this in and get the students, feeling better and doing better. And there's just been this shift in the last few years, recognizing that we can't ask teachers to implement social emotional learning or mental health prevention programs when they themselves may be struggling. So there is that shift. And now what we're seeing there's programs that try to serve a dual purpose, so that teachers are being positively impacted as well as students. I would say that's fairly new in the sense that some of the traditional programs in social emotional learning are adding a component, but they're really still trying to work out a comprehensive way to make that explicit. So, for example, Mind Up is a mindfulness program, and they do now have an educator component to it, and they are embedding it more explicitly, given the need and given the feedback from people on the ground. So, and there's research being done and has been done on Mind Up. Another program by Tish Jennings focuses on teachers. It's called the CARE program, and that really is focused on teachers. And I think they're involved in the Wellbeing network, I believe. And that's a program that now is actually undergoing a huge study looking at the effectiveness. And it's been around for a while. So that definitely is one that really focuses on teachers. There is more. Castle out of the US, they are updating their guide, their program guide, and that will highlight programs that really have that dual focus on teachers and students. So I think, from considering, say, it's if we look at the last 20 years, what we do see is the last 5 years, it's ramping up. Because of really what I'll say is a crisis in education. But Castle would be a good resource to look at, but there are some like the CARE program and then some other programs that are starting to do that dual purpose and doing it in a way that's really intentional, not sort of as an add-on or something nice to have. And I think that's where that's what's shifting now, is this more intentionality. The measures question, there's many measures that are out there. And in fact, Kim is heading a project now actually just looking at pro-social measures So one measure out of the many measures that people like to assess. And what's emerging, and it's not just in measuring, say, pro-social behavior, but there are so many measures out there, too many measures out there, and some are great measures, some aren't, and people create them, use them for a project, and then they fall by the wayside. And so we do need more work, intentional work, on looking at what are the measures that are really sensitive to change, measures that are could be used more widely, or adapted for different cultural contexts. So back to the pro-social, that one construct, measuring pro-social behavior, Kim is heading a project where they're taking all the measures that focus on that and looking to see which measures are strong measures, which measures have been used repeatedly versus, one-time measures. So, and in thinking about that project, that's one project that's, lasting for, probably years of work. And that's, not to mention, like, empathy and compassion and all that kind of stuff. So every kind of construct needs a lot of work. The other project I'll mention that I work with, and it's out of Emory University, is C Learning. And it's a non-secular social emotional learning program that they have implemented. It's implemented worldwide. It can be adapted, culturally adapted. And that program does actually do intentional work with teachers as well, through training. We're actually working on a project in Colombia with that. It's like, say, it's all around the world, but not everyone's involved with every project around the world, but I'm kind of involved in the Colombia one. And that one's a really interesting one. It has curriculum. The curriculum has been translated into many languages, and the trainers come from different countries, so they're able to train in different languages. So I think we are starting to see some really good momentum on this work, which is exciting.
Incredible. Thanks for sharing. And yeah, happy to stay connected if you're all looking for other global examples, because we've got folks who similar, like in Mexico, they're intentionally doing work around not just students and teachers, but also the organizational leaders, whether it's school leaders or other organizations, and have seen that connection. So yeah, happy to stay connected. Thank you for sharing. Really helpful.
I can just add, because I'm looking at my slides on a separate device here, that just to give you the overview in terms of the research we found that 75% of the research articles focused on the link between teacher well-being and student learning. 40%, and there's overlap, that's why the numbers don't add up to 100. There's 40% that dealt with teacher well-being and student well-being, but only 13% considered teacher well-being and student well-being and learning. So all three components. So we're kind of, hoping to have more work that really looks at how these areas are intertwined. And, and I think probably from our own lives, we know, like, if we're feeling better, we learn better, and we can influence others. So that definitely, I encourage, if anyone's doing research or interested, is trying to look at the very thing that Miriam was saying, is that the teacher well-being and student well-being and learning, and how that all interplays, which I think is really interesting. And depending on what country you're from, I'm actually from Canada, but I know, having worked in the US a lot, there's a big focus on academic outcomes, and so that's a huge measurement. And so sometimes from a policy perspective or from a practical perspective, making the cell for well-being on its own is a bit harder, because it's like, it's great, kids are feeling lovely, but I want to see the academic outcomes. So I think we might have more momentum in the field if we bring in that academic outcomes to show there is indeed a link. This is not just something nice to do. It has tangible outcomes for society and for and for learning, so that maybe policymakers will kind of take note of it more, to better understand that happy kids do better, happy adults do better.
I think, Denise, what you had said about the interplay of multiple phenomenon, I think is exactly the interesting point. And I think one part of the research finding that was that I'm still trying to work through what it means in the context that we work in is the idea that it very much aligns with my expectations that teacher and student well-being move together in the positive direction. As we're talking about like teachers who are feeling better, there probably is a link. I would expect a correlation with students who are feeling better. But in those contexts where teacher well-being is lower, what does that mean for student well-being? And there's been some good research done on, well, what if we bring in a third component there, and what do we think about what's the status of the student-teacher relationship, student well-being, and teacher well-being, and that interplay of how does the student-teacher relationship mediate those two connections, and actually that creates some, I think, confounding factors of, well, if the relationship is strong and student well-being is poor, maybe we could believe that like teacher well-being could still be good there, in where that like there's research that says if student behavior is poor but the teacher student relationship is strong, then the effect of the student behavior on teacher well-being is lessened, and then in a context where there's not as strong of a teacher-student relationship. And so those mediating factors, what you were just talking about, and bringing in those additional correlations, I think is an area where, when looking through the research, and I'm so glad that like your team and others are continuing to push the field and saying there's more questions we can ask. But that's an area, Fernanda, to your question, of that the research was interesting, that the correlation holds kind of in both directions.
That would be very interesting to look at a more complex design, and get some of those studies out there to look at those other factors. Just in the interviews, I'll just mention one thing that came up with again, Marion mentioned it was a very small sample, so it'd be wonderful to, expand that research. But we had a small number of students that talked about how they, in a sense, bypass their teachers for support. One saying it was a year in time. It was 1 year the student did not have a teacher that they felt was supportive and that they could approach. So they indicated that they just avoided the teacher for the year and turned to their friends and the teaching assistants, something similar that you're saying, for support. And that's how they got by. And another student talked about how, although they didn't have a great teacher for, it was mathematics in this case, it was a high school student, their motivation was they had a university that they wanted to go to, and that was how they cognitively kind of bypassed. They said, that was my goal, and maybe this teacher wasn't great, but I'll work around it because my goal, I want to reach that goal. So then they got tutors and all kinds of other support. So I thought that was interesting. And then a teacher also said, there's going to be students who will always learn no matter what. So now, whether to what degree that holds true for, the majority of students, I don't know. I think for some students that, that's going to be hard to overcome. But it was interesting that a handful of comments, even with a small sample size, came up around those other, confounding variables, if you will. So I think that would be really fascinating to look at those to see group differences. And
That actually raises a question, and I'm curious, both in the research and the interviews, the perspective you saw on certain like trait characteristics of teachers or of students, because the way you just said of like some students will always learn, I'm curious if we could say similarly, like there's some teachers who will always be feeling well. Did you see in the research that you had done or that you had looked through that there were correlations of teachers who either have certain skills or teachers who fit certain social or demographic are more likely to experience well-being in a positive way? Or I'm curious on perspective on that question.
That's a great question. And we didn't look at that in the scoping review because I was really looking at just sort of those links, but not characteristics. But that raises a really interesting question to now, certainly in the interviews, just from the interviews we did, one thing that I think we need to acknowledge is people that teach, educators that opted to participate in the interviews were more likely to be interested in well-being versus those who had no interest. So it was you can sort of say it was a little slanted, so it would be interesting to have the diversity somehow convince all a wide range of teachers who, even if they don't really feel there's any link and it's not their domain to be concerned about their students well-being, be interesting to get their perspectives. But certainly the teachers were interested in it, even if they had struggled.
Yeah.
And some acknowledged they had struggled with their own well-being, and in a couple of cases took leaves, but they were interested, and they understood that there is a relation, and even if they were struggling, and they tried to really focus on having reflective practices so they could better understand and appreciate how their mood impacts their teaching, their classroom atmosphere. And they did talk a lot about that, about differences when their well-being was low versus when they were having a day where it was great. Just everything kind of blossomed on a great day, and when it was a day of struggle, they were able to identify how their mood and their behaviors contributed to a more negative or challenging classroom environment. Yeah.
Really appreciate the insight.
It's interesting you shared like over 70% of the research you were going through are on like teacher well-being and student academic outcome. And I agree with you. My sense is I'm a colleague with Radha, so we work with partners like across the globe. I would say that I think that can be a very strong selling point, not just to US educators, but to like educators almost everywhere. Like increased teacher well-being, you also get greater student academic outcome, even though there's like a lot more benefit, and it's also for the teachers, right, to be well. On that selling point, is there any research or evidence that's like really significant, you think like it is worth for us to look into, just from the perspective of using it as a selling point, that like it should be a priority, teacher well-being should be a priority?
I would encourage you to look at research by Mark Greenberg, who's done a lot of work in this area on teacher well-being and the relation to student well-being and learning. And he also does write from a policy perspective as well, because I think it's, sort of a different way to kind of get the message across. Tish Jennings as well.
Sorry, what's the name?
Tish, Tish Jennings. She's at the JENNINGS. She's at the University of Virginia. And she would be a great person to look at some of her work as well. Both of those researchers really have done a lot of work. They've been, they've seen sort of the growth of social emotional learning and teacher burnout. So those, I would suggest they would be kind of key leaders in the field in terms of making the case for why we need to focus on well-being.
That's amazing. A related question, but a bit off topic. I know we're talking about teacher well-being and student well-being. If we want to learn more about how parents' well-being impact students' well-being, like what would be a good direction to look at?
Wow, that's a big question, because I feel like an interesting one. I feel like to look at the parents' well-being, you'd probably need to dive into the education literature, but also the psychology literature, and developmental literature. And that would be a big topic, an interesting topic. And I think there's a lot out there in terms of a lot of research that has, been generated looking at the link between parental mental health and child mental health. And so it's probably looking at through that lens. And I guess and I will, as a note, as we're talking about, different research, what was interesting in the scoping review, and you will, in the report, you'll see at the very end of the appendices, what search terms we used. That was also a challenge, because it wasn't just well-being, it was mental health. You'll see that we provide you the exact same search, so you could, duplicate it if you want, replicate it. It's all over the map. And so we had to take in a big wide net to come out with the articles that capture well-being. So that's another challenge. It's not just the definition, it's everyone uses different things. When, you know, I might talk about mental health, you might talk about well-being, someone, you know, talks about flourishing. And so you'll see all those search terms in the report. And so doing like something on parents, I think you need to cast the net quite wide to get the results back that you want. Yeah, it was very interesting to look at, you know, as soon as you took out a term, how much you missed. And it's just because, again, we don't have a consensus of what we label as well-being. And around the world, it's different as well, you know, country to country, in terms of that work. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Denise, just very quickly, a related question, but I think a lot shallower. As the children perhaps or the students shared with you when they have an off day, what is it that teacher does in class that sort of like, you know, make them feel better and sort of like engage, you know, related to this whole parenting, the home circumstances. So yeah, I'm just curious to find out if that came up in their conversation.
So we did have a question for the students, because we didn't ask them to define well-being because that's too complex for them. But we asked, you know, what does it look like in a classroom when your teacher is having, you know, seems like they enjoy teaching. So we use that kind of as a proxy question. For the students, though, we did have a question. How do you think a teacher feels and acts when a student doesn't seem to enjoy learning? So we framed it that way. And so some of the students responded that the teacher would try hard to engage them. They try hard to help them. Whereas other students, you know, and it's probably reflective of their own experience in school and what they've observed. Other students indicated that if a student doesn't seem to enjoy learning and, you know, they might be acting out or, you know, withdrawing, that a teacher might get frustrated, might get angry, might yell at them, might just give up on them. So we had both, depending on the students, both sides of the, where some students felt like the teacher would work harder to engage and others felt like, no, the teacher would just sort of give up. So it was really interesting to see. And I guess, you know, of course, the other thing that came from this project at the end was, you know, we did this project and then we identified about another 100 questions we would love to pursue. Like just that, as I'm talking to you, I think, oh, it'd be wonderful to look at student characteristics and the likelihood of them responding that their teacher would give up on them versus a teacher would engage. Like, are there differences in personality characteristics? You know, are students more optimistic and they're more likely to say the teacher would support, or, you know, so there's so many avenues to pursue that came from this research. Is exciting, but like a lot of questions.
So, hi, my name is Christine, and I'm from Austria, actually, and I'm doing work on mental health in Austria in the sector of education. And I did the TFA program, so I'm happy to see you, Rada. I did Teach for Austria in a school in Vienna. And we had 4 teachers within one school with kids from 10 to 14, which is unusual because normally you have up to 12 teachers showing up every day or almost like during the week. And this was very helpful because you have a different kind of relationship. And even if I felt like my day is not my best, and then I could tell the kids, and then I have a different kind of relationship with them. And this is what is happening and what I can, the findings you had, they related with my experiences. So I do know what it feels like. And the definition problem is a really big one because, you know, even in Austria and different schools, even in Vienna, if you go to a different school and if you talk to different teachers, you have like mental health, psyche, whatever it is, and they do have the definition on the profession or the holistic approach. So it needs to be defined within a school, and that's what I'm working on. So find a definition within the school so that everybody has an idea when we talk about the subject, so that we have a common ground. So that would, in my opinion, would make it really easier to have meaningful research on that as well. Because if you expect well-being being only like mental issues and not the holistic approach, then you give different answers to one question. So yeah, that's yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, at least in a school, to have some common language. So when we're talking about, well-being or a concept, that we're understanding it in a similar way, or at least we're understanding it, how the school is conceptualizing it. I may bring in a couple other pieces from my personal life, but I understand the school, what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about. That would be amazing.
Yeah, and the other thing that I found is the parental well-being and the connection, because it really depends on where do you come from, what experiences do you show, do you have an avoidant attachment style, do you have an anxious attachment style, and this shows up within the school as well. And even if you have like not the best parental well-being back home, if you have a great teacher, you still can have a better learning experience, and you can have like a positive relationship with the teacher and feel better in school, and it's easier for you to learn then. That's where I really would hope for more research on that, because it's a more holistic approach to, like, there's a whole environment behind a student. It's not only the school time, there is friends and the first relationships and stuff like that if you come up in high school, and and that affects learning.
I love that area. That's sort of my background, is youth who are more vulnerable and attachment. So and I know there was an amazing German study, which I cannot give you the site, but I went to a conference there several years ago, and it was looking at foster care parents, their attachment style, and the attachment style of their of the child, and looking at, if you have two avoidant attachment styles, it does not go well. But having a secure attachment foster caregiver with an anxious attachment, the outcomes are much better. It was really interesting research to look at, and I think teachers play that same role, to be that secure base.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Like the teacher could be the same person for a kid as the parent.
Yeah, amazing.
So thank you for your research. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you all for your great questions. I really enjoyed hearing sort of what's going around. I wish we had more time, actually, because it's so interesting hearing different perspectives from around the world. I love it.
Okay, so, well, thank you all for joining. I think we are on time now. I would like to let you know that the recording will be available. I will leave my email on the chat box. So if you want to email me in order to get the recording and share it with someone else, see it again, it will be my pleasure to share it with you. So here it is. And again, it was a pleasure to have you with us. It was a pleasure also to host this session with you, Mariam and Denise. I am very happy to have the opportunity to work with you again this one more time. And well, I wish you a very nice evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.